All right, it's 10 o'clock, so we're gonna go ahead and get started now. So good morning and welcome to the 2022 CRB Webinar Series. Today's webinar will provide an overview of rootstocks and new varieties. I am Caitlin Stanton with the Citrus Research Board, and I am joined by Mikal Machado, who will be running the polls and monitoring the chat, as well as Dr. Melinda Klein, who will be introducing our speakers. Please note that this webinar is geared towards growers and pest management professionals. Master gardeners can certainly benefit from participating, but any pest management methods presented, especially pesticides, should not be followed without a clear understanding of their use in home environments. We encourage you to ask questions during the webinar using the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen, and the speakers will answer all questions following their presentations. With that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Melinda, who will introduce our speakers.
Good morning. Thank you for that, Caitlin. I'd like to welcome UC Cooperative Extension Horticulture and Small Farms Advisor for Placer and Nevada counties, Cindy Fake. Since 2001, Cindy's programs continue to provide information and training on sustainable crop production, soil, irrigation, and pest management. Her research focuses on pruning and mulching in citrus to reduce tree stress, build healthier soils and trees, and mitigate climate change impacts. Recently, Cindy spent 3 months on sabbatical leave in Portugal and Sicily, working with and learning from citrus breeders and extensionists. Today, Cindy will provide a regional update. Cindy, please go ahead and begin your presentation.
So I'd like to briefly touch on 3 topics from observations on the 2021-22 citrus season, few impacts of unpredictable weather, and impacts of mulch in citrus. So first, a few observations about the 2021 citrus season in Northern California. Most of our citrus is mandarins with some navels and much fewer, many other citrus, but small amounts. So as you know, mandarins tend to alternate bear, and our variable climate now means that area orchards are no longer synced as they used to be. So this year, heavy and light crops were just about 50-50. And as has happened in the last few years, harvest started early, late October's for many of the growers rather than mid to late November, which resulted in essentially no available fruit in January from this area. Weather impacts, actually a lot of this is a weather report. 2021 weather was really tough on citrus and all perennial crops. Our rainfall was either torrential or non-existent. We had 10.5 inches of rain in 2 days, the end of October, which resulted in substantial fruit drop for some orchards. Then we had 2 storms of more than 4 inches each in mid-December, which saturated the ground, and more fruit drop, or it was so soft it was dropped to ground at harvest. Then the normal main rainy season from January to early April, that period was a drought with only increments of about 0.2 of an inch per storm for a total of a little over 1.5 inches over 3.5 months. So that was pretty severe drought impacting citrus. Then late rains in mid-April contributed to large growth flushes, and a lot of orchards had very heavy bloom and fruit set in this area. In Northern California, daily drying north winds have become the norm in the last 3 years, from April all the way through the fall, and that continues this season. We saw growth flushes in a lot of orchards showing drought stress, that's vertically curled leaves, before the new leaves were fully expanded last year and this year. Then, after the already unpredictable weather, we had a localized hard freeze in a number of locations on April 11th and 12th. There was significant damage to deciduous fruit and vines and nuts, but actually very little damage to citrus. Interestingly, though, new leaves in some of the orchards were bleached to a cream color from the cold, but very few were actually damaged, and they greened up within a few days or a week. So it was probably something about the nitrogen metabolism was not functioning because of the cold. In any case, it was a very new phenomenon for growers here. I got a lot of calls about white leaves, but there really was very little damage in most orchards. June drought has been very significant this year due to the drying winds, dry out the soil very quickly. And last week we saw temperatures under trees at 9 inches as high as 72 degrees, which is high for June. That's more like the end of July. Fruit is already large, probably because of the April rains, but growth is slowing down with our current heat. Today, above 100 degrees. So that's the weather report. A little bit about mulch. As some of you know, we've been conducting mulch trials in mandarin orchards for the last 5 years, and our results show highly significant differences between control and mulch in the maintenance of soil moisture. Mulch trees show less water and temperature stress and significantly reduced fruit drop, 9% versus 26% in control. Also, some new information, contrary to some of the literature, our results also show highly significant differences in winter soil temperatures under the trees. We now know that microbially active mulch under the trees increases winter soil temperatures by 2 to 3 degrees, which in our climate may help provide some cold protection and may also get the trees moving earlier in the spring, which could be good or bad, depending upon the very variable weather. So basically, a lot of what is going on here is very much dependent on this variable weather, variable climate that we now have, but that's the reality. And there's so many more things that growers cannot control because of the variability in the weather. So that's the Northern California citrus report.
Great. Thank you so much, Cindy, for sharing that information with us today. I want to check in quick with Caitlin. Do we have time for any questions, or should we go ahead and start with the main presentation?
We will move on to our next presentation.
Okay. So thank you again, Cindy. Next, I'd like to welcome today's speakers, Drs. Michael Roose and Tracy Kahn from the University of California, Riverside. Our first speaker, Dr. Roose, is a Professor Emeritus of Genetics at UC Riverside, where his program focuses on the genetics, genomics, and breeding of citrus and asparagus. His program has released 8 citrus Scion varieties, including the hybrids Gold Nugget, Shasta Gold, Tahoe Gold, and Yosemite Gold, and low-seeded selections from mutation breeding, Tango, Daisy SL, Fairchild LS, and Canal LS. Today, Dr. Roose will summarize research by his lab and others to characterize responses of citrus rootstocks, water use in salinity and calcareous soils. Michael, please go ahead and share your screen to start the presentation.
Okay, so welcome everybody. And so I'm going to talk about citrus rootstocks for California, particularly emphasizing aspects of soil adaptation, water use, and tree vigor. Kind of figures, the pictures across the bottom just give you an illustration of the diversity of responses of trees on different rootstocks. At this particular case, it's a trial of Moro or orange woodlake. So choosing a rootstock really involves a lot balancing your objectives and the various strengths and weaknesses of different rootstocks. So perfect rootstocks don't yet exist, and perhaps they never will. So, you know, really have to choose a rootstock that matches your situation and objectives. So, and of course, it's choosing a rootstock is something you're going to have to live with for the life of the grove. If you're not in that situation and you have an existing planting and you know what the rootstock is, hopefully, then your objective has to be to manage the block to avoid those stresses for which the rootstock has low tolerance. So it's still important to understand the differences between rootstocks. So things that you might have to deal with are things like Phytophthora control. If you have root rot in a susceptible rootstock, nematodes. Of course, often we tried to control these with fumigation before planting, but there are some after planting strategies also. But rootstocks are one of the primary methods of trying to deal with nematodes. For Tristeza, I think in general, because of if you have a spray regime for ACP, this will probably greatly reduce the number of aphids. And so Tristeza transmission rates are probably reduced, but it remains kind of a threat, particularly some severe strains of Tristeza that affect trees on many of the rootstocks that we commonly use. So as we're not completely safe from Tristeza. HLB, of course, is not yet in commercial grows in California or outside Southern California, but in general, lessons from Florida show that good nutrition and healthy roots are pretty important in determining how trees are going to respond to HLB, should it start to spread here. So the three things that I'll emphasize more in today's talk are the effects of rootstocks on salinity tolerance, response to calcareous soils, and drought. But of course, all these things end up influencing your yield and the fruit quality as well. And so the intrinsic yield and fruit quality of different rootstocks in the absence of stress also is a consideration, at least at the beginning, when you're choosing a rootstock. Let's see, there we go. First, I'll talk a little bit about drought responses. And I understand the importance of this, particularly this year, but there is not very much comprehensive data out there about drought response in citrus rootstocks. And the literature that exists is still confusing. That is, there's not just one simple answer. I think it's because drought is somewhat location specific. For example, Brazil, citrus is grown in areas where there are wet summers and dry winters. Rangpur is a commonly used rootstock in Brazil because the trees tolerate drought, but Rangpurs perform poorly in California, and our drought pattern is relatively different than that in Brazil because the distribution of rainfall is the opposite. Also in Brazil, they are using their fruit for processing. So what's defined as fruit quality is rather different than what's important here. Florida is a little bit more similar to perhaps to California than Brazil is. They get most of the rainfall in the summer still, so that's different, but they do have some winter rain more than typically than Brazil. Australia has a pretty diverse climate, but they do have major drought and salinity issues. So these are, there's some substantial literature on responses to drought and salinity from Australia that it can be helpful to us. The other issues, reasons why this is so complicated, of course, is that soils vary in their water holding capacity. And that's probably somewhat related also to the soil, other issues of soil that can cause stress to plants and the adaptation of different rootstocks to particular soils. So drought is not easily separated from this. The cultural practices you use, the effects of berms, mulches, how you're irrigating. I mean, Cindy just mentioned mulches and how important they can be. So all this makes it harder to come to a simple conclusion about which rootstocks are most tolerant to drought. Scion variety probably also has an influence when you're harvesting the fruit. And there are a lot of studies in the literature. This is a real conclusion I've come to from looking at this. There are lots of studies using rootstock seedlings grown in a greenhouse and then imposing a drought regime. But it's much less clear how well those predict the field performance of grafted trees. And so I think we need to do a lot more field work in this area. There are some known about mechanisms, particularly the mechanisms of drought tolerance that can be studied in seedling stages. It's the different growth stages may respond differently to drought. There are multiple adaptations of different rootstocks to drought, to different kinds of strategies that are used. In general, one important one is maximizing the extraction of water from the soil while minimizing the loss of water from leaves. So that will kind of mitigate drought effects. Deep roots are important in some situations, but not necessarily always, because if something is deep rooted, it'll be perhaps a bit buffered, but eventually you're going to still deplete the soil profile that's available, and then you're going to see effects of drought, perhaps just not quite as soon as something with shallower roots, depending on the water regime again. And various cyanate traits also influence this. Leaf morphology, how thick the cuticle, the covering on the leaves is. Narrower leaves tend to be associated with drought tolerance. So we would expect mandarins to be more drought tolerant, for example, than pomelos or grapefruit. And also changes in stomata. So drought tolerance remains a pretty complex trait, and something that perhaps is not so easy to use in choosing a rootstock for drought tolerance, at least with current information. Another major soil stress is iron chlorosis, and this we have done quite a bit of work on recently. So this occurs typically on more alkaline soils, about pH 7.5 to 8.5, and under those conditions, the availability of iron is reduced, and the typical symptom is the kind of chlorosis, intervenal chlorosis shown here. And it's just to give you an example of how, pH is on what we call a logarithmic scale. And the same thing applies to the iron that would be available in solution. So iron in solution is 1,000 times less at pH 7.5 versus 6.5. So what you might see as kind of small changes in pH have very big effects on the amount of iron that's available to plants. So there are other things that can influence this. Waterlogging the soil also affects the ability of the plant to take up iron, and you can induce iron chlorosis in the soil that you wouldn't otherwise have it by waterlogging the soil. So excess water exacerbates it. Water, the irrigation water, if it has a higher pH, this itself can lead to iron chlorosis problems or enhance the existing soil problems. Acidification of water is typically done to help correct soil problems or water problems, but how effective it is depends upon the amount of calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate in your soil. So soil tests are important in understanding what's going on. Of course, you can also repeatedly apply a chelated iron sprays, and that can greatly reduce the iron chlorosis, at least in the Scion, but it's quite an expensive approach. So you're better off to try to avoid the problem in other ways. We've seen iron chlorosis in various rootstock trials. So here's examples of some of the rootstocks in a Tango rootstock trial near Porterville. That's the soil is a clay loam, and the pH is 7.7 to 7.9. So it's a little bit high, but high enough to cause problems for some rootstocks. Carrizo these are ratings of the trees in the trial. The average of 12 experimental trees is what's represented by each dot. So Carrizo never really had much substantial iron chlorosis under these conditions, but some other rootstocks did. You can see here C35 having a bit of iron chlorosis, and as the trees got older, perhaps there's more of a problem in the lower soil profile. The roots start to reach lower levels, and we see it more severely. This still doesn't look too bad, whereas Swingle is quite a bit worse, and Rich 16.6 trifoliate had pretty severe iron chlorosis at the beginning, and it looks like it declined, but it isn't really declining. What's happened is that a number of trees on Rich 16.6 died and were removed from this trial. So the most severely affected trees aren't affecting the observations at these later points. So that's why it looks like there's a decline. And really the Pomeroy trifoliate is equally or maybe more susceptible, and it died essentially. So many of the trees died early that there wasn't enough to put them on a graph. Here's what some of those trees look like. Swingle was pretty among those that are very badly affected, and you can see a lot of dieback on the tree here compared to this Sunky trifoliate hybrid. And here's C35, and you can see the iron chlorosis in the canopy, whereas this C146, which is a Mandarin trifoliate hybrid, has essentially no iron chlorosis. Here's the Woodlake Morrow trial, another trial on a soil with some pH 7.8 and a kind of clay loam soil. Rootstock means here are on the for percent chlorosis versus the tree health rating is what's plotted here to show the relationship between overall tree health and iron chlorosis. So it's not just a minor problem for some rootstocks. All these ones over here, the cluster of points over on very low canopy chlorosis, or many very other rootstocks, but you can see that here Carrizo had some substantial amount of chlorosis. Trifoliates have a lot of chlorosis, and this is a trifoliate hybrid from the USDA breeding program in Florida, and it had quite severe iron chlorosis. So this is what a trifoliate would look like versus fir, another Mandarin trifoliate hybrid. So there's large differences in response to this among rootstocks. We also have done some greenhouse ratings of iron chlorosis response. And this is one where it does seem like there's pretty good correlation with field ratings. So these are, the graph here is chlorosis ratings for different rootstocks at two different levels of stress, 5% calcium carbonate and 15% calcium carbonate. And we see that pretty much the same pattern as in field trials. Among the susceptible ones are trifoliate, 4 different trifoliates here in these brown colors. Swingle, C35, X639 are all fairly susceptible. Carrizo much less susceptible, and then some of these other hybrids not very. Okay, salinity is the third of these soil stresses I'll talk a bit about. And citrus tends to show yield decline from soil salinity when the EC reaches 1.7 decisiemens per meter. This in your soil reports, it'll often be reported as millimoles per centimeter, but that's essentially the same measurement. It's equivalent. And so that you get about 16% yield loss per additional decisiemen per meter of salinity. But of course, this number is calculated with a particular rootstock, and we don't really know that all rootstocks will behave in the same way. Some may be worse and some may be better. You can try to reduce salinity with leaching. If soil salinity is up to 4, then 2 inches of water per foot of root zone would be required to reduce it down to a non-stress level. Rootstocks do differ in tolerance to salinity, and they also differ in response to the specific ions that are present. So this table is kind of the same thing as this first bullet point here, but it's telling you how much yield loss you get from either the root zone EC or the irrigation water that has higher EC values or higher contents of sodium chloride and boron, which are the 3 ions that we mostly see. So you get severe yield loss, for example, from in oranges when the EC is greater than 5. Oh, that table comes from the citrus production manual. So studying that is useful if you have salinity problems. Okay, so what about salinity tolerance? A tree that has higher transpiration will increase the uptake of chloride and other ions from the soil in general. So leaf chloride levels, this is just a consequence of this, that the leaf chloride levels are going to be inversely related to the water use efficiency of the tree. So the amount of growth relative to the amount of water. So if a tree grows well but uses a lot of water, it'll also take up more chloride than a tree that uses less water for an equivalent amount of growth. Things like membrane transporters that move chloride into between cells are important. Another thing that I think a lot of people maybe aren't aware of is that trees that have arbuscular mycorrhizae, these are more tolerant to salt. So the mycorrhizal network reduces salt stress to the tree. Overall, the tree tolerance is also influenced by the particular scion, and of course that should make some sense that a lemon, for example, may differ from an orange in how tolerant the scion is, and so if these toxic ions reach the scion, then you're going to see differences that are influenced by the scion as well as the rootstock. Here's a table. I kind of went through the literature and tried to summarize what's been reported on many of the commonly used rootstocks for salinity tolerance. There are some that are, the data is pretty reliable. Cleopatra, for example, is widely, in all these studies, these are 4 different studies, they're characterized as highly tolerant, and the 2 studies I found, sour orange is also highly tolerant. These are the best rootstocks for salinity tolerance. But there's some others where levels vary quite a bit. So carrizo is quite susceptible in these 2 studies, but in the studies done in Australia, it's really more in an intermediate range. And you can see other examples, trifoliate, very susceptible in 2 of the studies, intermediate in another one. So it's still hard to make a judgment on it. So then the last topic I'll talk a bit about is effects of rootstocks on tree vigor. So this is the vigor or size of the tree at a given age is influenced by quite a number of aspects of adaptation to the site and the Scion. And you know, tree vigor in any actual planting is always going to be influenced by various other kinds of stresses. So tree vigor could, in theory, could be measured in the total absence of disease if we could accomplish that. But it also need the absence of soil and water stress, climate stresses, compatibility. The Scion would also influence tree vigor in many cases, and even the genetics, that is, are you really testing rootstocks that are nucellar seedlings or zygotic seedlings? Typically produce trees that are less vigorous than nucellar seedlings, and so that's also an influence on individual trees. We do know of dwarfing rootstocks. Flying dragon is, as it's technically defined, Flying dragon is probably the only truly dwarfing rootstock for citrus. It dwarfs nearly all the Scion varieties. But there are some other rootstocks that are partly dwarfing. We would say that in general, trees of C35, trees on bitters, and this hybrid from the USDA breeding programs are semi-dwarf in size. But again, whether in a particular trial they appear that way depends upon what stresses were present in the particular location. So C35, if it's tolerant to stresses that are present, it may actually produce a fairly large, relatively large tree compared to the other rootstocks, even though overall it tends to produce a somewhat smaller tree. Here's a little bit of data from some different trials about tree vigor. So the canopy volume is what's being shown on the x-axis here, and cumulative yield on the y-axis. And this is these bars show the least significant differences. So if the differences are bigger than the size of the bar in either yield or tree size, then they're likely to be significant. So here we have ASRT with an African shaddock rubido trifoliate, which is typically produces a very vigorous tree unless it gets tristeza, which dwarfs it. But the yield is not comparable to the tree size. The trees are quite a bit bigger than others, and yet the yield is not comparably larger. The largest the largest yield in this trial was so far trees on C35, which have a somewhat moderate tree size, but it's still, out of all these rootstocks, about the 5th or 6th largest. Mac, on the other hand, has produced a very small tree size with a pretty good yield relative to the tree size, as do some of the trifoliates, for example. Here's another trial. This is a naval trial in Riverside. The data here comes from 5-year-old trees. Here we're looking at tree size again on the x-axis, and the tree health rating on the y-axis, where 5 is good and 0 means the tree's dead. So you can see here that how small the trees on Flying Dragon are compared to most of the other rootstocks, but some trees that they also didn't have a particularly great health rating, about 3.6, whereas Sweet Orange also having a lower health rating, and this experimental hybrid, which didn't work out so well in this trial. But again, here's this ASRT being very large, as well as hemiponderosa. So there are big differences in effects of some rootstocks on tree size. And generally, these are again being influenced by whatever health differences. But generally, you can see in this trial, most of the rootstocks have health ratings of 4 to 5, which are really quite good overall. So most of the trees at this stage are quite healthy. So this is kind of getting close to the intrinsic effects on tree size. Okay, so I want to end with just pointing you to some resources about learning more about this if you want to know about rootstock characteristics. Florida has produced a rootstock selection guide, and here's a link to it. I think the slides from this will all be posted at on a CRB website, so you'll be able to access them. Chapter 5 in the Citrus Production Manual which I wrote, has summaries of a lot of rootstocks. Kim Bowman is the USDA rootstock breeder in Florida. His website has reports on a lot of his rootstock trials, mainly in Florida, and the performance of different USDA rootstocks. And if you're interested in addressing drought, the California Institute of Water Resources has some tips about managing trees in the presence of drought. This is just what that Florida website looks like. It includes what's called an expert system. So the expert system will kind of interview you online, ask you a bunch of questions about what your soil type is, what climate, other things about the Scion and so on, and then try to help choose an appropriate rootstock. And this is what the tables from that website look like. So it's got tables of 48 different rootstocks, including some of them that are mainly used in California. You can see the ratings for different aspects of horticultural traits for tolerances. It's wider than this. There's a lot of information about diseases and other traits over to the right that you can't see here. So this is a pretty good resource they put together, and it does have some relevance for us in California. Okay, so I'll end there, and I see there are questions both in the chat and the Q&A, but I don't know, do we want to wait till the very end to take the questions?
Yeah, thank you, Mike, for that informative presentation. We're going to move on, and I am going to go ahead and pass it over to Melinda to introduce our next speaker.
Great, and thank you again, Dr. Roose, for sharing that information with us today. Next, our second speaker is Dr. Tracy Kahn. She's the Givaudan Citrus Variety Collection Endowed Chair for the University of California, Riverside, and she's curator of the Givaudan Citrus Variety Collection. This collection contains approximately 1,000 types within the genus Citrus and 27 of the 33 related genera in the subfamily Orontoideae of the Rutaceae. As co-PI in the CRB-supported core breeding program, Dr. Kahn leads program efforts to evaluate fruit quality traits for trueness to type and commercial potential evaluation. Today, Dr. Kahn will provide results of multi-year fruit quality evaluations of recently introduced cultivars that now have bud sources available from the Citrus Clonal Protection Program. Dr. Kahn, when you have a chance, please go ahead and share your screen and start the presentation.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So this presentation is a collaboration between myself and Tony Siebert, who you can see in the picture on the right. She is on the right, and Corinne Turnell. Okay, so this project, what I'm going to talk about today and what Mike talked about today are part of a larger project. This is our core integrated citrus breeding and evaluation program. And these are members of our team here. And you can see Tony and Corinne are also part of that. So this project is very large, and it has 9 different objectives. And so basically our central aim of the whole project is to develop and evaluate new Scion and rootstock cultivars. And and appropriate cultural practices to meet the needs of the California citrus industry. What I'm going to focus on today is a very small part of this. But first, before I want to get into that, I want to talk about the fact of what are the sources, or where do we get new citrus varieties for California? So of course, citrus breeding is an important source, especially we're talking about Scion breeding today. And this can happen via making crosses, which is hybridization. And there have been a number of varieties across the world, but local ones, Oro Blanco and Gold Nugget, were developed by that means. And there are a number of other ones as well. Another one is citrus breeding via mutation. And this is examples, an important example is Tango, also Daisy SL and Kino LS are other examples. The third source are introduced varieties from either within or outside California. And this is part of Objective 4 of our project. And there are multiple sources of varieties that get brought in either within California into the program or into availability by the CCPP or outside California. So they can be bud or limb spores and limb sports. And this is due to a small mutation or small genetic change in a bud that produces a fruit that it has identified to have altered traits. And so there are a number of examples you could pick. So one that got changed here, but should be Cara Cara, is so Cara Cara was a bud spore in Venezuela from a Washington navel tree, and someone found a branch that was producing fruit that were pink inside. It was found to be a stable mutation, and it was selected and became a commercial variety. I remember showing it to growers around 1997 and at the Sunkist annual meeting and asking people, don't you think this is interesting? And they were saying, why should we grow this? So, but in fact, now something that was thought to be somewhat, somewhat different is now a well-known variety in California. There's also can be Nuceller seedling selections. This was done a lot more in the past, such as Frost Nuceller lemon. There are things that are brought in as seed. And they could be genetically different from each other if there's zygotic seedlings. An example are these recent Australian fingerline seedlings that we brought in that selections are being made. And the last one are hybrids that actually are from outside California. And a good past example is W. Murcott, which was brought in as an introduced variety. And then the breeding program used it using mutation breeding to develop Tango. So introduced varieties are important in all sorts of ways. They introduce all sorts of things that we didn't have available in the past. And all of them involve that first you have to have a creation of genetic variation that establishes that's there, and then you have to select the ones that have observable or measurable traits that are thought to be valuable. And this can also be based on DNA markers or known gene sequences. And then generally what we do is either put them into small scale tree and fruit quality evaluations, which is what I'm going to talk about today, or larger replicated multi-location trials of these potential varieties. And I'll talk about one that has gone through that. But today, as I said, I'm going to focus on the varieties that were recently made available from the CCPP as part of their early release budwood distribution, or recently, one is a recently released budwood source from the CCPP, which is part of their foundation block budwood release program. Okay. So I've told you some of this, but there is, in fact, introduced varieties are very important, and we do still have to evaluate them. So when we do for quality evaluations, as part of Objective 4. We're comparing them to commercial standards that are related to them or genetically related to get basic information for California. So we use things like, we do tree traits as well, but for fruit quality, we look at fruit length and the width and the weight of the fruit. It gives us some sense of its size. We look at rind thickness and rind color, because how a color, if it's got more color, it tends to be more attractive. Of course, seediness is important. And bricks, or what's also called total soluble solids, or also called soluble solids, and percent acidity. And both soluble solids and percent acidity are used to calculate solids to acid ratio. And that's used for maturity testing of fruit in California. And soluble solids, or total soluble solids, or bricks, are measures of the amount of sugar content. Okay, so the other thing is that what happens when you introduce varieties is they can actually be valuable as breeding parents, if you're doing crosses via hybridization, or they can be important in terms of using mutation breeding to develop a selection that may be less seedy, as the case of W. Marcotte was used to develop Tango. There's also important to know that genetic data underlying those tree and fruit characters of hybrids, like in mapping populations such as Kiyomi crossed with Amoa, can actually help identify genetic markers that are associated with traits, and that can actually increase the efficiency of selecting hybrids with these valuable traits, which is one of the things that our breeding program is doing. And one of the varieties I'm going to tell you about today, which was an introduced variety a while ago, but is now first available through this easy early release program, is something called Amoa 8. Okay, so there's two sets of varieties I'm going to talk about. And this first set is ones that we have data on because they were brought in a while ago, but they are now first available through this early release program. And in most cases, introduced cultivars are evaluated as part of a small 2 to 3 trials from 1 to 2 locations. So there's no yield or pack out data that's collected. We can choose at some point if we think that it would be good to include them in a larger trial, but in most cases, this is the information we are collecting on these. Of those listed here, there's one, FEMMINELLO Santa Teresa, was part of this desert lemon trial. That were replicated desert lemon trial, where we collected yield and pack out data over 10 years, and I'll tell you more about that. Okay, so before I do that, I want to show you, this is the CCPP page, and I just want to orientate you. So if you go to the Citrus Clonal Protection Program page, and I've given you the email, the link above, the web link above, and first you want to go up in the top. You see with these green bars, the top one says variety data, and I put a pink circle around it. And this is where you can see all the varieties that are available from the CCPP, and whether the variety is part of the early release, because it has an early release next to it. Only industry members can purchase budwood on this early release list, cultivars, for about 1.5 to 2 years. Until that bud source, they have a bud source for the protected foundation block. One of the things that Georgia has told me is if you are not an industry member and you really, really want it, you can email them, and if they have availability within that period of time when it's on the early release list, then they will be able to make it available to you. Each one of the listing also has a link to our citrus variety collection, or our Givaudan citrus variety collection webpage with information on those varieties. And then if you click on going to the varieties or buying budwood, you can see you can shop for budwood either as part of what was listed as this early release list or part of the protected foundation block. And most of them are in the protected foundation block list. Okay, so I'm going to start with this first list and tell you a little bit about them. This is the only one that's not on the early release list. It's on the foundation block list. It's called Shiranui. It's VI 860, which is its number from the CCPP. There have been multiple introductions of Shiranui into California. It's also referred to by people commonly sometimes as Decapon, which is actually not the variety name, but its trademark name in Japan. There are 3 current introductions that are present in California, and all of those have completed the CCPP therapy testing and release program. So I'm going to talk about each one of them quickly. The first one was an original importation by Sunkist for Stark Brothers in 1998, and then the control passed, and it was bought by, it's a word missing, but by a company who has the registered trademark for Sumo citrus. So that's one of the introductions, and that's a proprietary introduction. There is a publicly available one called VI 860 that is now in the early release list, and it was described as coming from CNASS China. And then there's a third one, which is also a proprietary one, which is a private accession of a Brazilian strain called Julieta. All originated as hybrids from as a hybrid from Japan. So this hybrid that was developed in Japan is a cross between Kiyomi and Ponkan. And all 3 introductions appear to be the same basic cultivar and have very similar tree and fruit traits. You can see the fruit here. You can see one of the things that stands out about Shiranui is it has this knob at the stem end that's quite pronounced. It's also not a very smooth rind, but it has very high sugars, which people find very attractive. The other thing is that our whole group, as have a number of people, even the CCPP, have noted, but Tony pointed out that the publicly available one was remaining seedy in both Riverside and at Lynn Code. And so we had a discussion among a number of scientists, but also with a number of growers about the seediness issues of those who are currently growing it. And they are seedless when they're grown in isolation or far away from other pollen sources. But the fruit will actually be quite seedy if not isolated, and it'll depend upon the pollen source that's surrounding it. So if you use one of the worst pollen sources to have around it would of course be pomelos that could make the fruit quite seedy, as you see in the picture below. So based on the fact that there is a difference between whether they're isolated or whether they isolated from other pollen sources, gives us some indication that Shiranui is likely to be self-incompatible. And that's like clementine, many of the clementine cultivars, and why many growers have actually tented trees during flowering period. Okay, so here's another one, and this one is called Excalibur Red Lime. It is actually a Rangpur kumquat hybrid and not a lime at all in the way of what we think of as limes. It was actually an accidental cross from Excalibur Rare Fruit Tree Nursery in Lake Forth, Florida, and it's sold as a dooryard fruit. It's really ever-bearing, so you get fruit year-round, and it's quite productive, and the fruit is quite attractive because it has this reddish-orange rind, and the fruit are necked, so they sort of stand out, and seedy and acidic. And you can see from this data, from our data, that if you look at the external color of the rind, that Excalibur lime, which has much higher external color, it can be quite reddish orange than either a Bear's lime or a Mexican lime. The seed content is also very different too. Of course, bear's lime, because they have 3 copies of the chromosomes or triploid, have no seeds, but Excalibur lime has significantly more seeds than Mexican lime. The other data that we found, and we have more data on our website as well, is that the differences in mean acid from multiple sample dates. Mexican limes are much more highly acidic than bear's limes, and bear's limes and Excalibur limes, which are not true limes, have similar acidity levels. Also, if you look at the graph on the right, you can see that Excalibur fruit are sort of intermediate between Mexican lime and bear's lime in their size. This actually was interesting. This variety was actually received as budwood from David Karp, who helped bring this in. And in Florida, it's not only because it's attractive, but in Florida, this is of interest to chefs who make everything from special sorbets to red lime martinis with this cultivar. Okay, this is one I told you about earlier. It's called AMOA 8. And as I told you, we got seeds were given to us by Francisco Russo, who is a past director of the variety improvement of Instituto Sperimentale in per Agricultura in 2002, and this is in Italy and actually in Sicily. It's a hybrid of a willow leaf type mandarin, which are called Havana in Europe, and Moro blood orange. And you can see it has really quite intense red colorations, maybe not as intense as some of the lavender limes that were shown in the recent issue of Citrograph, but probably the most intense red colored fruit in the collection. It's actually named AMOA for Havana and then Moro. There is more data of this on our webpage as well. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit of data. And this is from a paper that we wrote that was called Pigmented Citrus Cultivars Can Differentiate the Market. It was from 2020. And what we know and what we've shown from this data is that AMOA fruit are the lightest and smallest. They also have quite a different shape from other blood oranges. They're more mandarin shaped because one of their parents is a mandarin. And it's also has rougher rind than these other ones, such as Shahani, which I'll talk about, and Kuzba, and 2 controls, Moro and Sanguinale. Yet AMOA and Moro have the most darkest internal and external coloration. But okay. The next one I'm going to talk about is FEMMINELLO Santa Teresa. And this introduction was included in the Desert Lemon trial. And that's because there was a bud source of this at Wilson Newcomb Nursery when we were setting up this trial. We have it originated in Italy as a selection of FEMMINELLO commune, and it is resistant to Malseco, which is an important disease there. And it purportedly has a greater fruit in the late summer as compared to other FEMMINELLO selections. And you may not realize that FEMMINELLO selections are the ones that are used commonly to make the liqueur limoncello. The budwood for this VI is now part of the early release. So this is now available for other people to propagate it. This was the first publication in 2015 we wrote on that, or the second one actually. And then this one up in the corner here is our most recent publication that came out in 2021 in Citrograph. And you can see of the 12 cultivars that were in this replicated desert lemon trial, over the length of the trial, what we found about this particular FEMMINELLO Santa Teresa is that it had a good first harvest, and this is over 10 years of data, and a good second harvest yield. And it was the fourth highest in terms, and that's what you're seeing on the left here, the fourth highest in terms of cumulative yield and the fifth highest cumulative yield returns. So this is not just yield, but returns when we got financial data from the packing houses just behind Limonera 8A. It's not as early in maturity as some of the others, with a smaller first harvest size and average exterior fruit quality. And the fruit are rounder in shape than some of the other lemons, and they have average juice content relative to the others in the controls. They have fairly high seed count, and they have average peel thickness, and they're not particularly smooth rind. But there is a lot of data. If you go to this paper that was released in 2021, you can find much more in comparison to the other ones. Okay, so here's another lemon, but this is a lemon that was actually, there was a request from a grower to put this through the CCP cleanup, and it is now available. And we've been collecting data on it, which you'll see on the left. It originated from New Zealand, and it entered the CCR collection in 1994, but it actually was on the station since 1930. So we have had it for a long period of time. It has slight pronounced pink internal pigmentation, which is due to lycopene. What we have found, and this is over the recent evaluations, that revertants do occur. And so it may not be stable enough. It also can vary in this pink coloration from light to darker. There's no leaf or fruit variegation, as is true in that other pink variegated cultivar that you may be aware of, which is variegated pink flash Eureka lemon. So this one is not going to have issues with, this is going to obviously produce more yield because it has more chlorophyll for photosynthesis. It's less seedy, and it has a larger fruit size than Limonera 8A. And that's what you're seeing here. You can see that it is less seeds than Limonera 8A on average, and you can see the mean fruit weight is different between the two. Okay, so this is another one that often people think of as specialty variety, but the CCPP and our group receive numerous requests for this cultivar each year. It's just gotten onto the early release budwood list for distribution. It's believed to be actually a hybrid between pepita and sour orange from China, but it's really most popular in Japan, and it's commonly used in cooking in Japan, which is why we've gotten a lot of requests. It was originally received as seed by W. Bitters or Bill Bitters from Japan. He was the curator of the collection back a while ago, and it, as I said, it came from Japan. It matures between September and October, so very early or earlier than most citrus. It produces very juicy fruit, and it's closely related to something called yuzu, which you may be aware of. Yuzu is often used to make ponzu sauce. It's harvested green, but when it's fully mature, it is yellow, like you see in the pictures here. It has many uses in Japan, but it's most popular being used to create vinegars or marmalades, but also used in seasoning for fishes and soups. And you can, one of the things that Bill Bitters pointed out is that you can, if you dry the peel, you can burn it as a mosquito repellent, which I thought was amusing. Okay, so here's some data that we've collected on it, and a publication that we produced back in 2009 that compared yuzu, sudachi, and kabosu. Its fruit are slightly larger than yuzu, and it's more rounded in shape and slightly pebbly rind. It has an average number of seeds per fruit is 17.2, so quite higher than sudachi, but lower than yuzu. It tends to be the least acidic of all of these three closely related types that are used in Japan. Okay. And there I've given you where the publication is. So this one is also on the new list, and this was introduced to, it's interesting, words got taken out, to the citrus variety collection by a guy named Frank Shahani. He was part of Tony Siebert's class for people who wanted to learn about citrus diversity and growing citrus in their backyard. And he told her about this, that one of his trees was producing, one of his navel trees was producing bright red fruit. And he brought some fruit to show her on the day they visited the collection. And the fruit was highly pigmented with this anthocyanin, which is the pigment that makes blood oranges red. And it had a navel, and it had few or no seeds and a smooth rind. So it clearly had characteristics of navels. It had the flavor of a navel, but it had this bright red coloration. It's not, it doesn't cover the whole surface of a cut fruit, but it appears like streaks across the surface. So it can look somewhat like a sunrise. The buds from the original tree were collected in 2008, and it was given to the UCR in 2013 as part of the gift agreement, and it's now has budwood available for people to propagate it. This is a bit of our data. We have a lot more data that is also on our website and is part of that publication that I mentioned earlier. We know that Shahani, Amoa 8, and Bukuzva had higher bricks or solubles, total soluble solids than, or sugars than the controls, Moro and Sanguinelli. It produced the heaviest and largest fruit of the 5 different cultivars, and it had high bricks to acid level that indicated that's earlier than some of those others, the 2 standards, Moro and Sanguinelli. It had lowest seed number with less than 2 seeds per fruit. You can see the 2018 data, but there's much more data listed on our webpage. Okay. This is a 2. This one is a little, was also introduced. This one came from Vietnam, and we compared it to Habana because it has very much a willow leaf flavor, and it appears to be somewhat related but distinct. 2 means black pepper, and it has a black pepper aroma to it when you eat it. USDA repository received this, and they got 50 seeds, and only 3 of them germinated. And 2 of the zygotic seedlings were propagated and planted in 2009. And we've had visitors that Dan Wiley brought in, a Vietnamese-born American citizen, saw this accession in 2017 and thought it had excellent quality. And she actually said this was the Mandarin of her childhood. And so there was a lot of desirability via the Vietnamese population to bring this into California. And yeah, so you can see some of the data here about this one. You can see there is a difference where sugar levels are higher in 2, slightly higher in 2 than Habana, and as is the for multiple dates over the time, the acid is slightly less, and the sugar to acid ratio is quite a bit higher. So these would be earlier than Habana. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a list of just a few things that are part of this early release, but they're not yet available for evaluation. So we haven't yet evaluated where we propagated some trees, but a few of these, but they are not, we don't have any fruit quality evaluation yet, but I've gathered some information for you from various different sources. This first one is from the USDA Florida breeding program. It's called US Ortnique LS. There is a variety you may be aware of called Ortnique that's been around for many, many years, which stands for Orange Tangerine Unique, which came out of Jamaica. And this is a low seeded selection of that. And it is a late maturing, rich flavored mandarin. So it has a really rich flavor, and it holds on the tree quite late in the season, like we're still eating them now. In mixed Florida plantings, they have about 5 seeds per fruit versus the standard 15 seeds per fruit in Ordinique. This next one is also part of that same program from Florida, the USDA program, and it's called US Sun Dragon. And it is a sweet orange-like hybrid and includes a Poncirus trifoliata as in its pedigree. And it's been found to have remarkable tolerance to HLB or Wang Lang Bing. The fruit are highly pebbled. They have a dark orange, they have orange rind, as you can see here, dark orange rind or what. And one of the things you see in the picture on the right is that the stem end is green, and that's fairly typical. And you can see that it's quite pepply. The fruit flavor is fairly mild and orange-like, but it has this distinct zesty note, which is coming probably from the Poncirus parent, which is only a small part of its parentage. They have released this because they feel it could be a useful parent for further citrus breeding and is best used as a pollen parent due to the small seed number per fruit. Okay, so then there's several others that are on this early release list. One is this Changsha mandarin, which was received as seed from Texas in 1963, that we've had in the collection for a long time. It's a small seedy mandarin. It actually has typical mandarin case characteristics. You know, it separates from its rind when it becomes mature and over mature. But the thing that brought it into California, or why people were interested in it, is that it has this cold tolerance. It's known for its cold tolerance. There is another one is something called Bidwell's Bar, which you've probably heard of. It is the oldest living orange variety in California. And one of the cool things, they wrote an article on it at UCR about this particular accession because it was VI 1000 for the CCPP. But it is one of the original type of oranges that was around very early in California's history. It's seedy, but has typical orange flavor. There is another one on this list called Fukumoto navel. This is a slightly different introduction of the navel. There was some decline of our current Fukumoto selection on certain trifoliates and chorizo when it's grown in California. And so that led to people, a number of scientists, and I think Mike Roose can answer questions about this later too, to sending it and testing this line in our original line in Spain, where they did not see any decline. We also got their line and our line back, and when they were tested by Craig Carlson, they didn't see any differences in terms of lessening the level of decline. Okay, and this last one I wanted to show you is something called the 9-pound lemon. There have been a number of requests for this budwood of this lemon. It has been observed at Disney's Epcot Center, and it was already present at the USDA repository. So that's the source of that introduction. There were some thoughts that it might be similar to Ponderosa lemon, but it appears not to be, and to be a different variety. But as you can see, it's huge. Okay, so I wanted to show you a list of things too, quickly. Here is our website. If you put citrus variety collection into Google, you'll find our website, and varieties can be searched either alphabetically or by the category, like mandarins or oranges or pomelos, or by our evaluation data. We are in the midst of updating our website. It's like almost done. It'll be done probably sometime this summer, and it'll have a slightly different look, and some additional information. One of the other things posted on our website is the Modern Citrus Cultivars Descriptive Database that was developed by David Karp. I'll show you a quick slide of that. It's all about proprietary varieties from all over the world. So it's not talking about publicly available ones, but ones that are available all over the world. So if you were looking for information about a particular one you heard about, that might be a database you could use. I've also given you the website for the CCPP, as I gave it to you before. Going to fruit displays, such as the one that happens in Lynn Cove in the second Friday of December, can be really important because you can just see what the fruit look like firsthand. We are going to have another UCR Citrus Day in next season. We haven't determined the date. We had it in March last year, in this year, and we in the past we had it in late January. So we'll have to figure out which date is best. Also, the CCNS and International Society of Citrus Nursery Society is going to tour the collection in September, or I think it's in late September. And their meeting is actually in California and Visalia. So that would be another opportunity to see varieties. I think that the next slide is just my thank you slide. We want to thank the Citrus Research Board and growers for your support of this research. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tracy. We're going to move on to Q&A. So I think the first question is for Mike. Many areas are moving to drip irrigation. How does the salinity and edge accumulation affect iron chlorosis in those trees? What is recommended for that condition?
Well, I don't think we know exactly the answer, but generally I think the roots will, if the soil profile has areas with high salinity and or higher pH, so that you see effects of iron chlorosis, but other areas that do not, I think the roots will manage to find the appropriate areas, and they won't grow into the areas that are too stressful. So I don't think it's going to have, too much of an effect. But I actually don't know the answer to this. Certainly I haven't really seen this. The question really becomes whether these stressful areas, whether the tree can have enough roots in the non-stressful areas. That's going to determine how it affects the overall tree health.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Can chlorosis be remedied by vinegar, acidified water, and soil?
Vinegar. I think if you got enough vinegar, probably, but I don't know. I don't think vinegar is a typical material that's used commercially, but I think it would certainly. Well, the problem is, you can't get, if you get you can't put straight, I think straight vinegar would be too detrimental. You'd damage the roots. So you'd have to figure out the appropriate concentration. But it should have a desired effect. It may be less efficient than some of the commercial products that are used to acidify water, but I think it maybe could be, and it could be that it's organic. I think the answer to that's probably known. I just don't happen to know it.
Okay. The next question is, so have rootstock and Scion field trials that were underway in the San Joaquin Valley, Ventura County, and the desert been continued? This seems to be the only real way to gain real in-field performance information on all the various combinations.
Well, yeah, some of them we have in the San Joaquin Valley, for example. We have a lemon rootstock trial. We have rootstock trials for Tango and Daisy SL. We have 3 rootstock trials for Tango that we're still collecting data on, although not yield data. So there are a number of them, and there are lemon rootstock trials in Ventura and in the desert. But the number is somewhat currently lower than it used to be. We've kind of been waiting to get access to some of the Florida rootstocks that have been tested there for HOB tolerance. And I think once we get access to that material, there would be a big push to put out a lot of trials in a number of places with different Scions, and using that material compared to California. I should also say we've tested some of our rootstocks in Florida, and some of the California rootstocks that were developed here and are available look fairly promising, although I think they're perhaps not equal to the best of the Florida rootstocks. But it's by chance, because they haven't been tested. They weren't developed specifically for HOB tolerance here, but some of them are performing well.
Mike, could you tell them how many rootstock trials you currently have? I think you know the number of that.
Well, we're kind of just in the point of shutting down some of them, but probably about a dozen. We have about 12 rootstock trials altogether currently that we're still been collecting data on.
Okay.
I didn't mention it, but I'll just say now, one of the trials at Lynn Cove, we are going to convert to a regulated deficit irrigation. So we're going to try to look at the effects of response of different rootstock trees on different rootstocks to this water limitation.
All right, we'll move on to the next question. If using a method of Phytophthora control that could result in resistance development, would that exacerbate the drought impacts if rotation of chemicals is not employed?
Yeah, because if you've got a problem with Phytophthora and then you lose chemical control, and we're pretty close to that now for Ridomil. Ridomil is not as effective as it used to be. Then you're going to have damage in Phytophthora situations. You'll have damaged root system. I mean, there are other strategies. There's, for example, irrigating on alternate sides of the row that can be used to both reduce water and somewhat control Phytophthora. So you can get less Phytophthora from regulating the amount of how wet the soil is as well. So there are other strategies, but.
All right, and the next question. Any chance that there is a grapefruit with low instance of Pharanocumarins? So many potential customers avoid grapefruit for that reason.
Yeah, I can answer that one. There is one in Florida. There is a grapefruit that is has no fluorocormorins in it. I'm missing the name right now, but I could make that available to you and provide that information. I'm sure you can leave your email with. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Sean. UF University of Florida 914. Thank you.
I don't know if that, that may be proprietary though,
It is, yeah, I think it is a proprietary variety.
And the other thing is we have a trial of a number of grapefruit-like hybrids, and some of those we haven't tested them for Pharanocumarins, which is, it's a fairly complex chemical test. But once we choose some of these to see if they have commercial potential, otherwise, then we'll probably test them for Pharanocumarins.
The interesting thing is that when they did test them back in the University of Florida a number of years ago, they also got fruit from the citrus variety collection of the same cultivars. And what they found is that it was influenced by the environment as well. So there were a number of things that actually had higher levels of fluorocoumarins in California than they did when the same cultivar was grown in Florida.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think we have one more question from David over here. What rootstocks are recommended for Italian pink lemon? Any incompatibilities to be concerned about?
Don't think we know anything about that. I've certainly not done any trials.
But what you can do is you can look and see what we have it on in the citrus variety collection. So if you go and look up that variety by its alphabetically, then it lists the rootstocks that we currently have it on. So we have it on compatible ones that are compatible.
Yeah, I think we don't know for sure if that's you could call it a Eureka or a Lisbon type. It may not be either. And so it's hard to predict exactly how it would behave. I probably, if I were planting it, I would stay away from trifoliate hybrid just because it's an unknown.
Yeah, we don't have it on.
You could try Benton, I suppose, but probably I'd put it on Mac.
I think we have it on Mac, and I think we have it on Volk, but you can go to our website and check. I don't know that off the top of my head. My map book's not right here.
Well, thank you, Tracy and Mike. I know we have a few more questions, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and put your emails back in the chat if anybody wants to reach out to you for additional questions. And then I'm going to pass it over to Melinda for a few wrap-up comments.
Yep. So I would like to thank Cindy, Mike, and Tracy for sharing with us all this information today, and our participants who are here through the duration for joining today's webinar. CRB is planning our annual California Citrus Conference. That's going to be held October 19th here at the Visalia Convention Center. We hope to see everyone at the conference, and more information will be provided in the coming weeks, so keep an eye out for that. But again, thank you to our speakers, and thank you for your participation.
Yep, thank you everyone. And if you missed any of our 2022 webinars, they'll be posted on citrusresearch.org within the next several weeks. Have a great day, everyone.